Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Teresa Ladrigan-Welpley. I'm Special Assistant to the President for Mission and Planning here at Salve, and it is my privilege, my pleasure to welcome you all this evening to our MLK Week 2026 Keynote Address and Dialogue. I want to thank you all for taking the time to come out for this event tonight, not only because, like me, you probably had to climb over some mountains of snow to get here. I know I would arrive at the end of a sidewalk and there was no way through, so you'd have to kind of be creative to find another way. And also in the case of our speaker, with multiple flight delays to be able to find their way onto our campus. But also, so thank you for ferrying all of that, but also for the way in which you coming this evening demonstrates a commitment to engaging with the critical concerns of mercy that are pressing issues on our own campus, in our nation, and in our world. And this evening, tonight, we hope that this will be one way in which all of us can make real the mission of our institution, to work for a world that is harmonious, just, and merciful, by seeking to redress these issues of critical concern. In an essay that was published in 1967 entitled, "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reflected, "Loose and easy language about equality," or we might add in our context, mercy, justice, and harmony, falls pleasantly on the ear, but there is a credibility gap we cannot overlook. With each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that we have come far enough. Each step forward assents an ever-present tendency to backlash. Our keynote speaker tonight will work to open up Dr. King's insight, and hopefully our own, by inviting us to consider how resentment, specifically racial resentment, functions in American discourse and communities today, disrupting our work for racial justice, harmony, and mercy. After Dr. Wilson's keynote address, Testing Democracy, Racial Resentment in American Life and Politics, we'll then move to a dialogue portion for our event this evening. And this will be facilitated by two members of our MLK Week 2026 Advisory and Planning Committee, Dr. Victoria Gonzalez, Assistant Professor of Sociology in the Department of Cultural, Environmental, and Global Studies, and Marsara Dunbar, a Senior Political Science major with a concentration in International Relations and Comparative Politics and a minor in Human Services. They will sit down with Dr. Wilson to engage his work and insights further. And then we'll also invite you, all of you here, to participate in this conversation, and you should have received a card on your way in. So if you'd like to, throughout the keynote address, jot down any questions or comments that you have, we'll collect those during that portion of our evening's program. So now to get things started and to formally introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to call upon another member of our MLK Week Planning Committee and co-sponsor for today's event, Dr. Mary Anderson, Professor of Political Science and Brodsky Chair in U.S. Constitutional Democracy and Culture here at Salve. Mary.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here today. And thank you, Teresa, for including me in this planning. I'm honored as the Brodsky Chair to partner with the Macaulay Institute and the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy to bring my friend, colleague, esteemed scholar, Dr. David Wilson, to our Salve Regina campus. Dr. Wilson is the Dean of the Goldman School and Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the co-author of Racial Resentment in the Political Mind, a book that you will be able to access as you're leaving, and he will sign copies for you, maybe. And his research examines how individuals formulate their political preferences about race and justice, and how social cognition shapes broader survey response behaviors. Wilson's academic specializations include survey research methods and experiments, psychology of survey response, political psychology and American politics, with an emphasis on measurement and an analysis of intergroup attitudes and political behavior. He holds life memberships in several organizations, including the American Political Science Association, the International Society for Political Psychology, the Midwest Political Science Association, Pi Alpha Alpha National Honor Society for Public Affairs and Administration, the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, and the Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. Prior to joining the Goldman School, Dr. Wilson was the Senior Associate Dean for Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Delaware, and a full professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations, with a joint appointment in the Department of Psychology and Brain Sciences. Dr. Wilson has also held senior positions with the Gallup Polling Organization, leading national and international survey projects examining topics ranging from workplace creativity to prejudice in politics. He earned a BA in government from Western Kentucky University. He holds an MPA, an MA in political science, and a PhD in political science, all from Michigan State University. Dr. Wilson is a military veteran with 19 years of service to the U.S. Army Reserves, including combat tours for Operation Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom. We are really honored for you to be here with us today, David. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, look at this. Can you hear me okay? That's great. First, thank you for the kind introduction. This has been, I'm sure, a busy and full week of activities, and I'm honored to be your MLK speaker this year. I've got some slides, and I've just kind of timed out my remarks so that we can maybe get through things, but I want to warn you in advance. I fell in love with data and statistics a while ago, and I tend to use them in my research. And so if you've gotten a copy of the book and you started reading it, my bad. It'll make for great bedtime reading. But it was written for a very specific audience around a controversy that exists in political science and psychology. And my colleague and I just had to take some folks down. And so that was the nature of the book. And I said, next time I'll send an article that kind of just gets to the point. You don't have to read 9 or 10 chapters. Anyway, thank you, Teresa, who have helped me. Thank you to my friend Mary Anderson for inviting me. Thank you to Jim Ludes and the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy, home of the story in the public square. Fancy. Thank you for providing this space for the hard work of democracy. Bringing together people to solve public problems is what public policy is all about. And I hear there's some really important initiatives here on campus to try and bring a minor to the university and hopefully engage everyone in public problem solving. Our conversation today is about our ability to co-govern so that everyone has an opportunity to live the good life. This is the ultimate promise of democracy, the aspiration that we can all live the good life. And this is also the idea that Martin Luther King Jr. fought so hard on behalf of the underserved, the vulnerable, and oppressed people to get across, that we all should be able to have an opportunity to live the good life. I am a political psychologist. Most people don't know what that means, so I thought I'd just start off by describing it. So politics describes the practice and process of deciding who gets what, when, and how they get things, why they get things. And psychology is all about the individual and how the mind processes information and then makes decisions. So as a political psychologist, I study human behaviors, the factors that motivate them, and the outcomes that result from this processing, but all within a specific context of political systems like our democracy. Democracies put different constraints on us than society in general. There are rules that we're supposed to follow, and it's hard sometimes to follow rules that you may or may not agree with. So when I say testing democracy in my title, I mean that I'm exploring and assessing our ability to behave in ways that align with the stated principles of our democracy and our democratic system. Things like change, that is, finding or creating a more perfect union, fairness, establishing justice, why? To have domestic tranquility, and policy and service, this idea that we're promoting the general welfare. The preamble to the Constitution starts with we the people. It assumes there is a we. And the first principle is establishing justice. Why? To ensure domestic tranquility. Once you have polarization or the lack of tranquility, you have conflict. That conflict, when it grows, can weaken the idea of we. Once that happens, you're on a slope to authoritarianism and other forms of government that don't consider equality important. So again, I hope to make some progress in explaining how the very justice that Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for to America and to the world can also hinder progress, far more than actual racial prejudice and racism in some cases. So as you might imagine, democracy is fundamentally psychological. It requires conformity to some rules, identity, established values like responsibility and honesty. You have to have a feeling that you can make a difference, that you can govern. You need efficacy, you need agency, you need information. Without these basic psychological ideas intact, democracy is somewhat hollow. It's simply a superficial bundle of institutions and rules that can fall apart at any moment. Just as we test our own human behaviors and the boundaries of our will and our might, we will also test our commitment and support for democracy, where equality and justice are supposed to be fundamental, but oftentimes they are contested. But this is also the place, at a university, within a democracy, where we can better understand how to secure the blessings of our liberty. The cornerstones of our democracy are this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life rather than persecution, liberty, self-determination rather than dictation, and the pursuit of happiness, well-being rather than suffering. Democracy never promised tangible rewards like homes, healthcare, Social Security, tax cuts, guns, or even education. These things all came in a new deal for democracy later after World War II. The old deal was actually about human flourishing, the right to exist as a free and equal individual with opportunities endorsed by government to live a good life. Now we know that the founders excluded many from this idea of who should live the good life, but let's put that aside for now. We can deal with that. But life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are about the ability to live that good life. Aspirations to direct our journey, sufficient opportunities to realize those aspirations, a sense of dignity, and the ability to pursue life with purpose. The hope was that identities would not get in the way of people living the good life, because democracy only exists if you have a true commitment to equality. These things all exist under the guise of rules that are already in place, like our Constitution. So what gets in the way of this promise of living the good life and opportunities for the good life? Well, I'm going to make the argument injustice. We are very attuned to the idea of injustice. It's not just a feeling or a mantra. It is we fundamentally, physiologically change when we sense or see or experience injustice in some way. So I'm going to argue that this injustice is so meaningful that people start to believe that government is no longer important. Governments, importantly, are instituted to protect our ability to live the good life through things like public policy, the provision of public supports, and regulation of harmful practices. But as humans, we need information to make public political decisions about equality under a condition of scarcity. And so we use the concept of merit. Merit is a praiseworthy quality, a level of character, or a form of conduct that deserves honor or esteem. It is subjective information, that is, it's up to us to decide on it, that signals that the person deserves to receive a reward or a punishment that is due. Merit operates within systems called meritocracies. These are systems in which outcomes like wealth and jobs and status and power are distributed based on what we deem to be meritorious. Even attractiveness is a merit in some cases. That what we deem is critical to understanding our current situation. Meritocracies are not fundamentally good or bad. They all exist to set standards that determine what is just or not. They operate under assumptions that merits are equal in terms of input, that they're not discriminatory, that they're equal in terms of opportunity, that they're achievable, that is, they're equitable. The most ongoing challenge for America today is this idea of how do we define merit and what is meritorious. Merit assumes that the activity is good. And when people think about who deserves a good life, it is those people who do good things that deserve the good life. Those people who do bad things should be punished and not have access to the good life. This is critical for understanding justice. So I really want to talk about the effects of race on our democracy and on justice and the promise of the good life. We know very well racism and prejudice, but we also now need to think about other language to understand how race operates. All of these things exist in our political minds because we're constantly testing the boundaries of change and difference in America. For many people, true equality is not worth the effort. They have freedom, they have options, they have choices. And I don't know if you've ever tried to put two magnets together. If there's any scientists in the room, repulsion, two magnets come in, and then they stop. So imagine if you have hierarchy and you're trying to take those in power and those without power and bring them closer together. The more you come close, everybody has to give up a little bit to have true equality. And then when you get close, sometimes you have to give up something that you cherish so much that you decide it's not worth the effort. So I'm interested in the effects of race on justice and the promise of a good life. The role of government. So I do public opinion research, and in my surveys, I run these experiments where I randomize different versions of questions to respondents. For example, in one survey, we asked questions, how much of a role, if any, do you think government should have in trying to improve the economic position of blank? That is, this is a question about principles. How much do you think government should have a role in trying to improve the life of blank? And so we randomized a bunch of different groups, and the first one was people. That's what we call a control group or a baseline. People doesn't have any character or descriptor to it, it's just people. So each respondent receives a treatment. One group gets the control, another group gets randomized to treatment. So we randomized a bunch of other groups, African Americans, poor people, people who suffer natural disasters, poor families, those who've lost homes, single mothers, small business owners, and unemployed people. Everybody only got one version of the question. Experiments assume that if there is nothing to the treatments, then all the responses will be equal. There should be no reason to discriminate if the treatments don't have an effect, if they don't matter. So again, each respondent only received one version of any one of these categories or targets for the question. So I'm going to show you the results. Here's the distribution. The blue bars are the percent saying government should have a major role in improving the lives of the group, and you'll see the groups along the bottom. And the red bars are the percent saying government should play no role in improving the lives of the group. So you can see the people category, which is the baseline here, 47% of people say that government should play a major role in improving the lives of people. That's one baseline. The other one is 14% say that government should play no role. Now, if you're starting to do your analysis, you can see kind of where we go. So 47% of people is our baseline for major role. Note the extremes on the far left side and far right side of the graph. People who suffer from natural disasters, 74% of the public said government should play a major role in improving their economic position. To the far right are African Americans, where 31% said government should play a major role. Now, as you look at all of the groups at the bottom, and you start making your comparisons to both the people in the US and to all the groups, it's clear that there are likely merit criteria that influence how people think about the role of government in improving the economic standing of different groups. And we can think about these through principles or politics or isms or attitudes and behaviors. The real question is why. Now, note that there's only one racial group in the entire setting and mentioned among the list. And if the only factors that explain the responses were racism and racial prejudice, then all of the other non-racial groups should be equal. But they're not. Discrimination exists along beliefs in terms of non-racial groups as well, even from people in the United States. And again, note that these are not mutually exclusive groups. Like poor people could suffer natural disasters, single mothers could be poor families could be African Americans and the like. But information matters to people. They start evaluating the why. This is politics. So we wanted to explore this further in another study. We asked respondents the extent to which they agree or disagree with the statement, public policies that provide economic assistance to blank make them too dependent on public support. Similar question, but different framing. So there's always an argument that giving out government aid makes people too dependent, and therefore we shouldn't do it. In other words, this group is not deserving because others will suffer for trying to help the undeserved. So the baseline categories is, again, people. And I want you to pay attention mostly to the blue bar, which is those who agree with the statement. So 35% of the public agree that public policies that provide economic assistance make people too dependent on government. Now, let's look at these things. To the far left, you have racial ethnic minorities, and the far right, you have military veterans. 41% of the public agree that providing economic assistance to racial ethnic minorities makes them too dependent on government, and at the far end, only 13% agree that providing the assistance makes military veterans too dependent on government. Now, as you look at the groups, note how the agreement declines and the disagreement, or deservingness, increases as you move from left to right. Farmers, senior citizens, and military veterans all receive higher levels of disagreement with the idea that economic assistance creates dependency than racial ethnic minorities received agreement for. So you can see 57% for military veterans disagree that it creates dependency, but for racial ethnic minorities, that's 24, but that's 41. So that disagreement in taking a stance for veterans is larger than support for racial ethnic minorities. Now, this is a smart room, so I think you've probably derived that none of these groups is mutually exclusive. Once again, they don't exclude the others. Racial ethnic minorities are certainly people. They can be unemployed. Military veterans can be farmers and senior citizens and the like. So there's still something else going on besides racism and prejudice and sexism and other biases that exist. And our task is to figure out, why are they not equal? We know that the public discriminates and discerns who deserves what, but we want to know why. Okay, so racial attitudes. This was something that I was asked to kind of talk about, like distinguish like what you mean by racial attitudes. So what's the difference between the two? So, just so I'm trying to get my laptop to come one more time. All right. I'm sorry, the thing blacked out real quick. All right. So racial attitudes are those beliefs, opinions, and judgments and emotive expressions about race. In the social sciences, we classify all of these things as simply racial attitudes. Now, people are most familiar with racism and prejudice, but they are not the only racial sentiments that matter. So let's go through some definitions. First, prejudice is an attitude. It's a feeling. It's affect. Prejudice is essentially, I don't like you. Now, again, we're just talking about individuals. So I know we'll think about systemic and systematic racism and prejudice and the like, but right now we're just talking about individuals. Prejudice doesn't move with the group. Once you're prejudiced towards a group, it doesn't matter what the group does, you don't like them. Similarly, racism, and specifically, again, individual racism, is a derogatory belief that one group is inferior to another group because of genotypic, phenotypic, or cultural traits that define the group's membership. It's more general than prejudice and more akin to a belief system, a feeling towards something. One might say that racism actually produces prejudice. But again, there are many things that can produce prejudice. The key things with racism are hierarchy is important. Racism assumes that the traits, being black or white, are the actual determinants of someone's social behavior and their moral and intellectual qualities. It's a bit different than just not liking. With racism, simply having the racial trait, just again, being black or white, means and legitimizes that you're inferior. So if you are racist, you fundamentally believe that groups in a hierarchy are not equal, and specifically racial groups. Again, the key element for racism is inferiority. You can dislike someone without feeling like they're inferior. So two football teams that don't like one another, and the bad team may win, the group says, oh, they were the better team, we're going to beat them next time, we still don't like them. Racism and prejudice both target groups and people because they're members of the group. It follows the individual. Resentment's a bit different, and I want to make sure that we follow the lineage here. I'm not talking about racial resentment yet. I'm talking about just resentment. Resentment is an anger over an undeserved, positive, or even cherished outcome. When somebody gets something they don't deserve, we resent it because it's not fair. Resentment is not just being angry, it's like an indignation. It's an anger that's tied to moral beliefs triggered by a perceived injustice. It's grounded, literally grounded in justice. And the only way we can evaluate deservingness and therefore justice is on merits. So I talked about merit and meritocracies. If you're thinking about how to deal with resentment and therefore this perceived injustice, you have to think about the merits of anything. So let me just tell you about how resentment operates. Let's think about a line. Now, no one's ever taken a class on standing in line, but we all know how to do it. We all expect that once you're in line and you're in the front, you're closer to getting your just desserts, and those who are in the back, they're further away. Everyone feels like they know the rules about lines. It makes perfect sense. Now, if someone cuts the line, we instantly wonder why. And if we don't have something that gets us to a quick conclusion, like they're a family with infants under 2 or a military veteran, or they don't have some status, this is the airline thing, we want to know, well, why are they cutting the line? This is not fair. I get in line before this other person. We just want to figure it out. We don't really like special considerations inherently. We need to know why. We need to know the merits of why someone ought to get something different. So if nothing is obvious, again, they're not elderly, we say, how dare they? And we pause and we start to kind of think about the why a bit more. If we can't come to some conclusion, we feel like this is unfair, this is bad, we can't let this go. Somebody else is just going to start cutting the line, and then before you know it, I'll be at the back when I spent all of my time working hard to stay in the front. When individuals and groups are not deserving of some cherished advantage, resentment follows. That's because justice has been violated. So belief in a just world, believe it or not, cutting the line threatens the status quo system of merit. It allows the undeserving to benefit from unfair or unjust actions. A belief in justice in a just world is a psychological concept that explains why we tend to expect a normal ordering of things, a status quo, to remain intact. We typically like the way things are, especially once we've gotten them figured out. We don't like to change just for the sake of helping others. We want to change mostly to advance our own needs and our own self-interest. So threatening the existing set of social expectations opens the door for uncertainty and fears. They fear mostly change. Again, what's the target of someone cutting the line? Well, then everybody will start cutting the line, and then it'll be okay. Chaos, anarchy, uncertainty. So resentment is a moral reaction to injustice. And just to explain, again, we have 2 concepts. Justice is a balanced state. So we often talk about the scales of justice. And when they're balanced, they're equal, they're fair. Things are good. There's no real anger or upsetness. Good things are happening to good people and bad things are happening to bad people. That produces satisfaction. The world is working fine. You're on your way to work. There's no traffic. You're great. But the minute somebody cuts in front of you and it causes some delay, that's when you have disruption. That's when you have an imbalanced state. Well, that's not fair. I'm driving the way I'm supposed to drive, following the rules and the like. Why am I not being rewarded? Why is this person just cutting me off? It's not fair. That's injustice. Now, again, we're not just talking about simple fairness or simple terms. This is how the mind actually processes how things happen and the merits of whether or not that was a right or wrong thing that occurred. Like, we are literally processing this very quickly. So, racialized resentment. So all of that, the good life, the merits, deservingness, racism and prejudice, all of those things are a part of this conversation about racialized resentment. So racialized resentment is anger over how a racial group uses race to gain an unfair advantage. Right? It doesn't mean that a racial group dislikes or hates the other group, just that they want the rules to favor their way of life. Racial resentment occurs because race is perceived as an illegitimate criteria for reward or group enhancement. Using race, in their minds, is unfair, it's unjust. I can't use it, how can they use it? They don't believe race is merit, those with higher resentment. Racial resentment motivates a need to punish the rule breaker, at least admonish them for their improper actions. And the rule follower, they can deny that the rules are problematic. And the rule follower can also say, I don't have anything to do with a solution because I think the world is just, is fine the way it is. This justice motive is activated when bad things happen, or things that you disagree with happen. The important piece that we found in our research, and I'll share some findings with you shortly, is that dislike and hatred, prejudice and racism are not required for resentment. They may play a role, they also may not play a role. The key is that racism and prejudice exist and follow the individual. Resentment, which may be operating in tandem with racism and prejudice or not in tandem with it, resentment lives well beyond racism and prejudice. And you can think about this with a simple thought experiment. If you removed, right today, it's over, no racism, no prejudice, you still have inequality in the world, and you still have a democracy. So how do you then bring them together? Then resentments will take over. They'll start thinking about justice and what's fair. Do I have to give up my identity as a minority just to be equal and the same? Assimilation? That's not fair. Do I have to give up my place in line just to let other people be equal when I don't think they've worked as hard as I have? And I didn't do anything to them. That's where the repulsion starts to happen, when we have to deal with this uncertainty of giving an inch or giving a little bit. So again, racialized resentment is really a belief that race is unfair merit. And I'll share just a little bit later around, even African Americans can resent whites for their standing. They may believe that whites are using race to gain an unfair advantage, not attending to discrimination, not trying hard enough to get to know the problems we face and the like. So resentment is a characteristic tied to justice that everybody has. Now, how it becomes racialized or gendered or economic or tied to age and the like, those things need to be studied individually, but you can't just call everything related to race, racism, or prejudice. If you do that, you lose the ability to actually come up with solutions that solve those problems. So our book was actually trying to say, all right, let's show that racial resentment is distinct from racial prejudice in its most pernicious form. That is, we want to separate the racial from the racist, and then ask what difference it makes that when one says they're not racist. Our research basically says, so what? You can still enable racial injustice and inequality. We are actually expanding culpability around racial injustice by saying, even if you are an ally, you can still be a hindrance to racial justice. So this follows some work by Lawrence Bloom, who says we need new language to actually kind of deal with racial conflict and racial injustice. Everything that happens may not be a form of racism. We need more varied and nuanced moral vocabulary for talking about the domain of race. We need to articulate the range of values and disvalues implicated in race-based beliefs, actions and interactions, and institutions and practices. If someone displays racial insensitivity but not racism, people should be able to see that for what it is and have some dialogue around that. I can say, why are you racist? I can say, why are you racially prejudiced? Or I can say, why are you angry? And you can think about which one might engage dialogue better, or more effectively or less effectively. We have an additional language now to think about this stuff. So how do we measure these things? And this is critical to our empirical findings. So we've been developing this scale of racial resentment over the past maybe 18 years, and we've arrived at a 4-item survey set. So in public opinion surveys that we primarily use to study politics and political behavior, we actually ask people questions, they give us responses, and then we get into our statistical analysis to find patterns. Now, the good thing about data is you can just ask it questions and it will tell you if these processes we use are correct, and in most cases these are. So I want to share with you the language, and I want you to just think about the underlying construct behind them as it relates to what I said about merit and fairness and who gets what, when, and how in deserving this criteria. So here's the first one. I resent any special considerations that African Americans receive because it's unfair to other Americans. Now you can read this question and ask, all right, if someone holds that belief, are they a racist? Are they racially prejudiced, just on the definitions I gave earlier? Or are they resentful? Well, it says they're resentful, and it says on what basis. So this kind of anchors the scale. The second item says, for African Americans to succeed, they need to stop using past racism and slavery as excuses. How many of you think excuses are fair game? I don't get up on time and people get upset. I say, I ate too much last night. Anyway, third item, disadvantage. Special considerations for African Americans place me at an unfair disadvantage because I've done nothing to harm them. You can think about whether racism is underlying that, or is there some element of fairness and blame and deservingness. African Americans bring up race only when they need to make an excuse for their failures. Now, these questions aren't comfortable questions, but we find when we ask them, again, over the course of the last 18 years, people don't have a problem responding to them. We don't find bias that people are just saying agree, 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 or disagree, disagree, disagree. We find an actual distribution when we put all these items together in a scale. We find a distribution that's what we call normal. It's kind of bell-shaped. Not many people are at the extremes. Most people are somewhere in the middle. That helps us identify different patterns. Our task now is to show that this is doing what we think it ought to do. So we talked about just world beliefs, and we talk about threats to the status quo. We analyze relationships between racial resentment, which is always on the horizontal axis, and these different, the vertical axis for racial resentment, and these questions around just world beliefs and concerns about change are on the horizontal axis. As you can see, the more racial resentment that someone has, the more they agree that society is set up so that people usually get what they deserve. The more racial resentment someone has, the more they believe that everyone has a fair shot at wealth and happiness. The more racial resentment one has, the more they say, we must work hard to defend and preserve the way things are. And the more racial resentment one has, the more they agree our values and beliefs are constantly under attack. Their fears about change, their concerns about deservingness, their beliefs that the status quo is fine. We don't need to do anything. They're not saying that another group is bad. Racial resentment is saying we have a problem with the way certain groups use race. It may be motivated by racism and prejudice, but it's the deservingness appraisal that's motivated, not the resentment. All right, that's the key thing to remember, that the deservingness appraisal is about merit and what people think about the group in merit. The resentment is the reaction. It's the triggering when they see something that happens. All right. So you might be saying, yeah, David, this is all good. It's all the same. Does it really make a difference? So we went a bit further and we said, all right, if this is really racism, then it should correlate with what we know are real measures of racism and racial prejudice that exist. So we created, in the General Social Survey back in 2010, which kind of led to this debate in political science and political psychology, we created this scale that basically coded people for their support of these different ideas, that blacks are poor, blacks are unintelligent, blacks are lazy, racial differences between blacks and whites are due to lack of will, racial differences are due to inborn ability, and racial differences are due to lack of education. So we basically created this scale. We counted up the number of ones that someone had, and it ranged from 0 to 6. And so we have a bit of a measure of racial prejudice. We know these are measures of racial prejudice. They've been used for a long time, and they should be highly correlated with racial resentment if they're the same thing. So again, 0 to 6, and we basically standardize these things to put them on a scale. This shows the actual relationship, and statistically, it's near 0. As you increase your level of racial resentment, your level of racism doesn't change at all. So we have a measure of racial prejudice and racism, and we have a measure of racial resentment, and they don't seem to be correlated. But the data are dispersed enough. Each one of those represents about 25 cases, so there are thousands of cases in here. There's enough data for us to actually look at quadrants. So those who are high in both racial resentment and racism, and those who are low in both. But then we also have these off diagonals, which is really cool. So we can look at those who are lower in racism and higher in resentment, and those who are higher in racism and lower in resentment. We have these 4 quadrants, and they kind of look like this, and in our research, we gave them names. So those who are higher in racism and higher in resentment, we call them active enablers, and this was enablers of racial injustice. Those who are low in both, we say they're racial refrainers. They don't really need to use race so much. Those who are low in racism but high in resentment, they're passive enablers. In other words, they're low, so we're giving them kind of a pass in general of racism, but they're higher in resentment. And then they have the traditional enablers who are low in racial resentment but higher in racism. I know this is a lot. But the key is we can detangle the difference it makes that you're a racist, that you're resentful, or some combination of the two. And this is required in social sciences. They don't want to just believe you and take your word for it. You got to prove it. All right, so we have 4 groups. So the first thing we looked at was a belief in white privilege. So we asked the question, another part of the survey, we said, whites are generally treated better than other groups in American society. Do you strongly agree, neutral response, disagree, or strongly disagree? Higher scores on this mean that you believe that white privilege actually exists more. And oddly, we really didn't expect this much bit of consistency, but oddly, those who are lower in resentment, regardless of their level of racism, tend to agree. And those who are higher in resentment, regardless of their level of racism, tend to agree. When you look at racism versus resentment, at least when it comes to something like beliefs about white privilege, resentment seems to say, we're not privileged. We're no better than anybody else. That's just an excuse that people use to explain them not working that hard. Another question we asked was a question about racial fatigue. Again, these are not explicitly racial questions. So why are they tapping into racial prejudice and racism in such a consistent pattern? I'm tired of hearing people talk about racial problems in the US today, racial fatigue. The more you agree with that, the higher your score. The less you agree, the lower your score. Oops, sorry. As you can see, those with lower resentment, again, are consistent. They disagree more with this item that they're tired of hearing, but those with higher resentment, see, they tend to agree more. The resentment is tapping into this idea that why do we always have to talk about race? I don't have any problems with other racial groups. Let's just quit making a big deal out of it. We're all the same. Let's all be colorblind. And when we push policies that say, no, colorblindness isn't real, you can't do it just like that, then they say, well, why are you forcing us to do something we don't believe in? Why are you forcing us to change in ways that put us in the back of the line? That produces more racial resentment, not always racism and prejudice. We did the same thing with the question about racial apathy. Some racial groups may have problems, but it's no business of mine. We find the pattern of agreement is more around low resentment and high resentment, regardless of level of racism. So for those with lower resentment, lower racism, their score is 1.88. Higher racism, lower resentment, 2.0. That is lower than those with higher resentment. There's more agreement on resentment than there is racism. And that's what these issues around, hey, why do I have to be a part of the solution? Blame, denial, avoidance. Those are key to resentment. So we're slowly detangling what is really racism and racial prejudice from what's racial resentment. Why is race so problematic today? In the past, we know, and it hasn't gone away. There's no apology for any of that. But still, people, if you remove all of racism and prejudice, you can still have some problems here. So once again, same pattern with racial problems being a concern. We ask the extent to which, how concerned are you personally about race relations? Is it something we should be talking about? Those lower in resentment had higher scores. They're more concerned than those in high resentment, regardless of your level of racism. See, similar. Resentment predicts responses to this question more so than racism. All right, so it's helping us to detangle. So white resentment is basically kind of tapping into something different than racism and prejudice, and we now have the empirical information to kind of prove it. There's a low correlation between these measures, and we've shown it again and again. This is just the clearest way to kind of prove it and get to that point. And again, this is a kind of social science exercise. Sometimes we like to just talk about what we feel is right. We like to say things because we're comfortable with language, we're comfortable with the way of doing things. That status quo is no longer sustainable in understanding race. It now operates differently in the political mind. And it operates differently because we tried to produce more equality by creating special considerations. It was fair because in the past, there were special considerations for not being white. And so now there's a movement to kind of push that way. But Supreme Court decisions have now said, race can no longer be used in the same ways that you've traditionally used it to offer special considerations. So we wanted to make sure that we could talk about this in a real way. Lastly, I wanted to talk about anti-racism, which is one of the categories, strategic areas for Sisters of Mercy. So critical concerns, really powerful mission. I hope everybody has to recite this or memorize it and stand up and say it in front of the university flag. But Really smart. So coming out of COVID, George Floyd, Trump, all these things were problematic, and all of a sudden anti-racism became critical. Anti-racism is about action, not just about saying you're against racism. It's about action. So we decided that we were going to write up a research project, and we got it published in Public Opinion Quarterly, and it was testing the idea that can you just oppose racism and be okay, or do you have to actually take action? We created something called our anti-racism action orientation scale, because we wanted to see if people are just kind of non-racist, how far will they go? But if they're resentful, how much does that get in the way? If they're open to change, how much does that get in the way? If they're not concerned about race, how does that get in the way? If they're Democrat, liberal, conservative, or Republican, how much does that really matter? If we talk anti-racism, how do we actually implement it? We can't just say be an anti-racist, you've got to think about this. So we created this scale. This is the first one that was done to measure anti-racism in terms of an action orientation. And it was about agreement with 3 items. The first one is best to keep your feelings about racial prejudice to yourself. The second one is I want to say something about racial prejudice when I hear it, but the safest thing for me to do is be quiet. Third one is I believe that I will make too many enemies if I were to say something about racial prejudice when I hear it. The more you agree with these items, the higher your level of anti-racism action orientation. The more you disagree, the more you disagree, the lower your anti-racism action orientation. The anti always gets me. The higher your score, the more action you're willing to take. So we thought that there were some key predictors that are connected to racial resentment: resistance to change, white resentment toward African Americans, again, these political affiliations and identities. Just to get to the heart, so we first looked at those who are more or less resistant to change. So resistance to change here and open to change, the dotted line is open to change, the solid line is resistant. You can see that those people who are open to change are more willing to take action than those who are less open to change. But as your racial resentment score increases, the more those who are open to change become more like those who are closed to change. In fact, to the point of even if you are kind of open to change, if you have higher racial resentment, if you're resistant to change, you have higher racial resentment, you're more oriented towards action than someone that's open to change. In other words, racial resentment brings those people who don't want to take action together. You can't just say be anti-racist, you can't just say be open to change. So we thought about, well, what about political allies? Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and liberals. And the solid line is Republicans and conservatives. The dotted line, the supposed allies, are Democrats and liberals. And again, at the lowest levels of resentment, things work as expected. This is good. But at the highest levels of racial resentment, even allies can become more resistant to action. That is, you have to solve the challenge of racial resentment, which is not necessarily racism or prejudice, which we just showed. This was important for really thinking about what are the policy solutions and prescriptions. So being a non-racist is not enough to produce anti-racism. You need real action. We have one measure, and we've called for other scholars to come up with other measures of anti-racism. And even our political allies can sometimes slow progress on racial justice. One thing that you can do is, again, if this is a problem about change and merits, well, maybe you can talk about merits and redefine them, and maybe you can teach people how to address change better. These are just basic things that you can get started on to move people closer to anti-racism action orientation. Change is not scary, right? You can teach people how to believe that, and you can teach them how to rethink merits. If experience is important, then maybe experiences with harsh environments might be worth celebrating and giving more credit to than just grade point average. All right, so we believe racial resentment is a powerful framework. You can use it for both whites. In other words, whites view African Americans as using race to skirt merit and avoid responsibilities. They conclude African Americans are undeserving of special outcomes. African American resentment, which we talk about in chapter 8 of the book, African Americans may view whites as using race for oppression and denying responsibility. Whites are undeserving of their superior status. Resentments reflect the presence of wounds. They really say more about someone that's harmed or fearful or uncertain about the future. And if you could just kind of remove that, maybe you can make some inroads. But what they wind up doing is, instead of dealing with their own wounds, is they project onto others. They blame the victims. They blame those who they don't know. It allows them to manage the discomfort that maybe they're not doing their part. Maybe they need to actually engage or embrace, be mindful and be a part of the solution. Giving actually does quite a bit. Service actually heals the soul quite a bit. Giving, they say, giving is better than receiving. It's actually true in terms of research. So I want to thank you for tolerating that long bit of data in theory. And the point is, you can use new language to think about race, and you can then think about policy prescriptions in different ways. So I apologize for the technical issues, and I'm happy to talk and take questions later. Thank you. Where do I sit? I'm in the middle? Yes. One of these
You want to
things.
sit in the middle?
Thank you, I'm sorry.
Hi. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here as part of MLK Week. It is a pleasure to join in this conversation with you and Marsara. I find that, the book is, as a sociologist, sorry, I'm not a political scientist, my apologies. I find that the most compelling part about this book is that it forces us to sort of grapple with the fact that some of the greatest barriers to racial justice in the United States are not always expressed overtly with hostility or explicit racism, but they're these deeply held beliefs about fairness and deservingness and how democracy is supposed to work. And I think this intervention feels especially important during MLK Week, since Dr. King challenged not only hatred and bigotry, but also what he called appalling silence and moral comfort for those who believed the system was fundamentally fair, even when it was producing deeply unequal outcomes. So all that is to say, thank you so much. This talk was really fascinating. The book is amazing. And I just want to start off, what do you think is most misunderstood by either the public or scholars, anybody that you discuss these topics with, about racial resentment today?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for being on stage. This is powerful. My first job, by the way, was working as a legislative aide on the team that got the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday passed as a national holiday. And we chose Day of Service, National Day of Service. Again, you have to pass legislation to make national holidays because people get the day off and somebody's got to pay for that. So we chose service because we know that Dr. King really cared about giving as a form of making right and justice. And that it's not supposed to be a holiday where you just kind of take off and have parties and barbecues and things like that. You're actually supposed to live and walk the walk. And so that was powerful. So the thing that, and that experience actually helped me think about race differently, because as you know, in the late 60s, King came into conflict with those who really wanted to push for racial justice in a different way, wanted to be more assertive and more, let their anger kind of feed their activity. And there was some value in that. But he also believed, well, maybe we could be a bit more passive and show that we're not threatening. So groups are having to balance that. And again, within race, you can think about the hierarchy the same way, is that once you move closer to, the wealthy blacks and the non-wealthy blacks getting closer, and it's across all racial groups. You say, I don't want to change that much. I like to keep. So same thing with racial language. Racism and prejudice work in our minds. I'm going to get you off that. And you say, wait a minute. If you start telling me it's not racist or prejudice, then that gives license. You become an apologist for their behavior. It's like, no, there's culpability that's expanded in this. So getting people to see that we can talk about race without just walking up to someone and labeling who they are, because that hits them directly. But what they think about other groups in terms of actions, how they think about whether they want to be angry or not, whether they want to penalize others who may be working as hard as they are, like slaves, right? Like this idea that slaves are less than, but they're working harder than you and you value work. Let's have a conversation around why you're angry about this idea that others are getting something they don't deserve. That's a dialogue that we can have. But once I call you a name, it's out. So people are comfortable with using that language because it has worked, and it was true, and it is still true. But there's also expanded politics around race now that even operate within race, as you can even see in the current administration.
Thank you for
Getting people to change is hard.
Well, just to follow up, I know we're supposed to go back and forth, and then I violated that automatically. But one of the things that I found,
That's the status quo you just violated. So
I did. I'm
get
so
mad
sorry.
at it.
But I mean, just to follow up quickly, since you mentioned this, I read this on page 244, and one of the things that you're talking about is like the banality of racial resentment, that, you know, if it's not racism and if it's baked into all of these other things, the quote that stuck out to me was, "Such banality makes racial resentment frightening." And I think that that's exactly kind of what you're alluding to, is like, how do you change if it's so kind of baked into all of these other things?
Yeah, well, it starts with some really good research. It starts with expanding our thinking, and just quite frankly, most of the literature on racial prejudice and racism was written by white scholars all the way up until 1996. This research started with a debate with some very prominent folks in academia, and when we went up against that idea, it was like, how dare you? Like, why are you doing that? And these folks had a tree of scholars that were out there, all of whom had a stake in a certain way of thinking about racial resentment, because there's another version of racial resentment that says it's just prejudice. It's a blend of disliking blacks because they don't work hard enough to achieve the things that they're asking for. They're pushing too hard against us. It makes sense that threats to the status quo can be resented. It doesn't mean it's just racism and prejudice. Sometimes there are other things operating. And if you put all these things all in a model and try to predict policy stuff, we try and explain differences in response or explain variance. Usually the racial attitudes only explain a little bit. And so what's explaining all the rest of it? So you can imagine a big pie, and if only 3% of that pie is covered or explained, what's explaining all the 97%? And we don't really talk about those values and practices and levels of understanding. And that's what we need to do to really get to solutions in politics around either race and even non-racial issues.
Thank you.
You kind of touched on this already. In your work, you describe how confusing prejudice and resentment can get in the way of democracy's progress. How have you seen that historically being stunted, and then even in our current time?
Yeah, well, just cut to the chase. Like when people just say that the president is racist or someone else in the administration is racist, it may be true. But there's other things that they are that are problematic as well that we have to call out. And some of those things are related and some aren't. They're just individual things, like being a mean person. You don't need to have an attitude towards any group to be mean. But when you blend mean with a position about the value or the importance of race, then you get closer and closer. So having a conversation about politics now, if you just call a person, racist, that's part true, but they also are sensibly wealthy, even though maybe they didn't do it the right way. They're also older, so they deserve some level of standing. They've also gone through a process of getting elected. They're also head of their party, and they've convinced enough people to work for them. There must be something there that people like. So let's have a conversation about why they're so opposed to certain kinds of practices and policies that may help other people. Why do they have this antagonism towards people who are working hard to come to the country because they believe in the dream too? That's a conversation we need to have in order to solve the problem that we're experiencing now in democracy. So talking about the anger, talking about the meanness, talking about what do you see as unfair can really help us kind of advance politics in a new way. I mean, it's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it's a bit more functional than just pointing out the thing that we know a lot about. And my colleague and I say this a lot. We've done enough studies on racism and prejudice to know everything. Nothing's changed about racism and prejudice since the 1940s. You're a color, people don't like you or they think you're less than. There's nothing that really varies on that. But there are a host of other things like racial apathy, racial sympathy, racial resentment, racial egalitarianism. All of these things matter in politics, and we're trying to get people to think about those things as well.
Good, thank you.
That's my pleasure.
Oh, thank Thank you for that. I've got,
Marsara is a political science major from Minneapolis, and we should really thank her for her heart being in Minneapolis, but her presence being here on stage today. There's a lot happening, and I'm really proud of you and that you're on the stage.
thank you. Absolutely, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because my follow-up question for you was, you said that nothing's really sort of changed about like racism and prejudice, but I'm wondering if, as social, historical, cultural contexts change, if there are just different ways that people are kind of navigating their own feelings about particular racial groups, right? I was wondering, as I kept reading this, I know that you mentioned immigration a couple of different times, that people that are high in resentment also, feel certain ways about immigration, right? They're, again, more likely to be against immigration and against services for that population that is coming in. But I'm wondering also if just, historically scapegoated, marginalized communities have kind of, evolved and changed over time, right? Jewish population, Japanese population,
Irish,
and
Italians,
right.
Jews,
Well, yeah, you go way back, right? Irish. I was just wondering if our current climate that's very, very focused on population that is, who are migrants, right, and the immigration issue, if that's in any way maybe changing some of the issues around like our racial animus that's existing. If you have any thoughts about that. I know because the book ended with comments about,
January 6th?
Exactly, yeah, which I thought was really fascinating.
We just, anyway, we predicted a lot of what's happening now just by thinking about the injustice. We talked about the retaliation. So just quickly, the question about immigrants is interesting because, of course, the current administration is supporting immigrants from some places, but not others. And we know that those are targeted attacks. But their strategy is really to distract. It's really to get you thinking about, these things that are newsworthy while there are other things that are happening behind the scenes. And so they're playing on the lens of danger and hostility, these stereotypes, these ideas, and they're not talking about during the campaign, they weren't talking about groups so much, but now they are more because they're losing the narrative around immigration in general. And you think about, well, what is it that they're talking about when they use it? They're just saying they're getting things they don't deserve. They're taking our jobs, they're committing crimes, not being caught. They're blaming the Biden administration. They're talking about, too many people at the borders and threats. You're talking about in places like Ohio. You're not bordering Mexico. So the argument works. People start to believe, well, that's an injustice somewhere. A threat to injustice somewhere is a threat to justice everywhere. You play on the justice narrative, you've captured people's attention. So that's the thing I think that's happening with immigration, and it's sad.
I just think it's interesting because it seems like there's certain racialization processes that are making it into the propaganda that I think could potentially be really interesting to think about racial resentment against groups that are not races, right, or perceived as races, if that's sort of changing how people respond to these questions.
Well, so this is what's interesting. Like, we know race is a social construct, so why do we think it's done? We're going to keep constructing it. Gender is a social construct. We're going to keep constructing it. Political identities are social constructs. We're going to keep changing them as power shifts, ideas shift. So maybe, just maybe, we could think about race in different ways, that even if you're an immigrant that's white and from Finland, maybe we can think about you just because you're an immigrant as racial. It's not that you're one particular race, but you're different than citizens, air quotes, and that's enough to say us and them. Identity is a powerful thing. Identity is the story we like to tell about ourselves, and we like to believe we're good. We like to believe we're fair. And then when things that are happening to others that seem bad, we rationalize it. The scales of injustice are done. Like, bad stuff is happening, turn the channel. You don't have to see it. Bad things are happening. Well, what they do? They shouldn't do those things. We see that in Minneapolis, right? So people, human beings, were motivated to kind of balance the scales. Cognitive consistency, managing cognitive dissonance, if you've taken your psychology class. We're always trying to make sure we're being consistent. And that's what the balancing of the scales are. And so race is undergoing kind of this evolution that keeps a little bit of the bad stuff. But what you say about the bad people, what you say about the bad people is something related to injustice. Like, they're not just saying immigrants are just bad and we don't like them. They're saying they're doing something they ought not to. That's a moral evaluation. And that's really what's at the heart of this administration's strategy, to get you to be against the morals of it.
Thank you.
We see how racial resentment really affects how we move through life, even if it's your conversations you're having with other people. So in what ways do you believe that racial resentment can either be mitigated or completely eliminated in realms such as like academia?
That's a good question. So think about anger management just for a second. You can go through anger management and be more conscious of what makes you angry, what triggers you, and how you react. You can videotape yourself and see what happens. But the more you go through anger management training, the more you're aware of it. But it doesn't mean you'll never get angry again. Like, you can't always control that. You can go through counseling to deal with sadness, but it doesn't mean you'll never be sad again. So we can have counseling and policy interventions that address racial resentment and racism and prejudice and gender discrimination and immigration policy. It doesn't mean it'll go away forever, because we're wired to think about ourselves relative to others. Social comparison is another function of needing to have an identity. We categorize, we compare, we favor whatever we've adopted through identification, then we go through great lengths to differentiate ourselves from others. And I think it's going to be hard to remove any of this. Again, you get rid of racial prejudice and racism, and you're still going to have things left that create racial injustice. So I don't think you can eliminate it completely, but you can make it more explicit that people are targeting for a reason, and we need to talk about that reason a bit more. And talking won't solve the problem, but it at least moves the barrier down a little bit, the guard down. And then if you can make slow inroads through that, then you can hopefully arrive at some common agreement. Democracies don't come with liking everyone. In fact, tolerance is key to a democracy. You gotta let, unfortunately, the KKK march down the street. It may not feel right, but once you stop that from happening, you go to another community, they're gonna say, okay, NAACP, you can't walk down the street. It's not morally equivalent, but that's not how the law kind of works. So democracies are constantly going through these bumps. Reconstruction was a powerful time period for African Americans, and then there was a backlash. Civil rights movement, powerful time for African Americans, backlash. Barack Obama, powerful time for African Americans, backlash. Democracies do this thing. Same things with gender, same things with youth. I'm at Berkeley, so student movements, free speech movements. Now they're putting restrictions on expression, like openly and overtly. At some point, the resentment for those who are being oppressed is going to fight back, and it's going to create more change. And we have to think about what that world looks like. That's why this is a good question. It's like, okay, we know Democrats are going to be in power again in the future, or not who's in power now will be in power in the future. Do they use the same power exertion that the current administration is doing? If they don't, will people say, well, now you're not being strong enough, you're not giving that payback, you're not getting your pound of flesh and fixing things. So this is gonna be a constant kind of test of democracy. It's a great question. You guys are dangerous.
Yeah, no, I talk to my students about this all the time, right? That there's almost, this 2 steps forward, 1 step back, cycle in our democracy and in our society. One of the things that you mentioned that I kept thinking about when I was reading this, you mentioned making things explicit. And, as a sociologist, I kept thinking about, implicit bias, colorblind racism. You make reference to Eduardo Bonilla Silva on a number of occasions. And I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts on, using survey research methodology as a way to tap into implicit biases? Do you feel like you've been more or less successful? Do you think that there are ways to, so this is maybe one of those questions that I haven't fleshed out yet, but I guess survey research methodology as a way to tap into implicit bias is my one question, and then another is, like, how do we let people know about their own implicit biases, or are surveys a good way to tap into that for the individual? For example, through Project Implicit, I don't know if you're familiar with Harvard, I have students that take that all the time. They're like, I'm not racist. I don't believe the results that have come out of this. But it's that same issue of implicit biases present to us very differently than explicit biases.
Yeah. So there's a lot.
Sorry, yeah.
So when I was in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at University of Delaware, we had a fMRI, so we could look at the brain under different conditions. And Sam Gartner, who was one of the founders of implicit bias, was one of my colleagues there. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about. So implicit racism is this idea that your mind works faster to make associations that you're familiar with, that may be out there in the ether that you don't agree with. So for example, they would give people like very quick pictures of negative words and then quickly flash images of African Americans. And they look for this pattern of consistency, African Americans or whites. And if you were more likely to associate race with the negative words and positive words with another race, then that was an indicator of implicit racism. But the research suggests, well, maybe you're just more aware of the stereotype, and that's your brain working faster. So we're all familiar with stereotypes. It doesn't mean we endorse them. So your brain is doing one thing much faster than your conscious is doing, and that's what the implicit racism measure tests. We all have implicit biases, everyone. Your mind is moving faster and you're doing things before you know it. Sometimes somebody has to remind you, you didn't address them the same way you addressed these people, or you actually kind of moved out of the way when this person walked, or this person you treated differently. We all have those biases, and they really come from our identity. But making them explicit involves people being open to that. And so the easiest way for people to be open to different communities is to kind of force them to work together. I'll tell you this secret thing my professor did in undergrad. We should be a lawsuit or something, but it didn't happen. We had, this is Western Kentucky University, had a class of 30 students. It just turns out that it was almost balanced. There were 20 African-American students and 10 white students. This was a civil rights and politics class. My professor did a simulation of the student sit-in movements, where African-American students would go to white counters and sit there and ask to be served while getting milkshakes poured on their head and slapped and punched and all kinds of things. And she wanted to reverse the situation. And I mean, it was brilliant. It was dangerous. Stanford Prison Experiment I don't know if you've heard of that, people should be sued. Yep. But what we learned, and I recall, like, one of the things I was gonna do is smoke a cigarette and blow the smoke in the student's face. This is not good that I'm saying this out loud, but it told you because that's what we saw in the video. So I didn't smoke cigarettes. It didn't work out really well, but I just blow it. And then another student got so riled up in the thing, they pulled a student off the bench and dragged him, and another student kind of threw water at the student because we didn't get enough training on how to do it. We just said, let's do this. But when the professor stopped it, we sat down and had a conversation. It was really powerful because it wasn't that they were kind of opposed to student sit-ins, but they didn't realize the extent to which people had to sacrifice and put themselves in jeopardy, and no one was there. No, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you're suffering in the slightest and no one is there to help you. You're alone. That is one of the primal fears of human beings, being alone. We're social creatures, and when we're alone, no one's there, it is terrifying. And so for those students that were in the room that the African-American students got to abuse, they were like, finally, I know kind of this fear in a different way. And so a part of kind of learning about others is really switching roles to build empathy and having people play different roles, argue different sides, take different perspectives, and kind of imposing that on people as a criteria for a job or for a promotion or for something, not just cultural training, but actually take those shoes off and take those shoes off and switch. Now walk. All right, come back and switch back, whatever. But that kind of process is different than saying, stop abusing people, stop being biased, stop doing that. People don't know how to. They don't have the tools for it. So, long answer, but that's a
No, it was
question.
a long rambling question, so I appreciate the
Tit for
answer.
tat. Scales are balanced now.
Yeah, they are.
We received some questions from our audience members. So our first one is, do you see a way to act on this understanding and untangling of concepts of racism and racial resentment when they are fed by a universe of narratives that are fed by misinformation?
Yeah, it's hard. So what are the tools for countering misinformation? So misinformation is kind of misleading, but unintentionally, like no real implicit. Disinformation is you're doing it on purpose. You're trying to get people to do things, telling them the voting station's over there, and that's where you should vote on the day after voting is allowed. Like disinformation and misinformation, how do you counter those? Well, you have to give people tools of where to find facts. You have to encourage them to do it on a regular basis and not just periodically, like every 4 years or every 2 years. Like it has to be ingrained. Civic life, civic science, civic systems have to be ingrained in us to have a democracy. And information ethics, that is giving true data and true information, that's so under attack now at the federal level, like not doing good surveys the right way, not collecting administrative data the right way, putting it all on the states. And then once the states do it, there's no continuity across states, and you can't make broader inferences about patterns that are happening. It's a real threat to the broader issue of democracy. And so how do you kind of get in the way of that? Well, I think you gotta kind of impose civic learning on it. Understand how local government works. Who do you go to if your water's problematic, if the streets are dirty, if the lights are out, if the schools aren't heated? Know your local level. Know your state level. Spend time there. I did a study called The Political Psychology of American Democracy. We found that people know more about the federal candidates, people running for federal office. They feel more comfortable voting for people for federal office, but they believe their vote matters less. We asked them about local and state government. They know less because there's 20 people running and they don't use party all the time. They don't understand the role. County clerk, what does a clerk do? I don't know what a clerk does. Or a circuit judge. What's the difference between a circuit judge and the other kind of judges? So we don't really pay attention to civic life at the local and state level, but that's where all the action happens. That's where democracy actually takes real effect. Your congressman, local elected official. Local. Nobody in other states voting for them, just your district. Senators, they go to Washington, D.C. They're state elected officials. No one federally votes for them. The state votes for them, then they go to Washington, D.C. You should treat them like that. You should hold them accountable in that way. Don't let them tell you we're going to Washington to change it. No, don't change Washington, change us. Make us better. And that's a new way of thinking about politics now. But we've got to get better at state and local.
Thank you for that. So we've got a couple more questions, probably not get to all of them, but this one is a good one. So thanks a lot. You talk about the need to redefine merit, which I agree is really important. Could you expand on this idea a little bit more, please?
Yeah, what's meritorious? What's worthy of reward? Or the merits of a case, for example, are also about punishment. You think about what kind of student you want here at the university, what kind of colleagues you want, peers you want. You probably want people that are relatively open-minded. You probably want people that are pretty good students in terms of grade point average. You probably want people that have some experiences, maybe abroad and different. They bring something new to the table. If you just have everybody the same, you really don't learn. It's like there's no variance. There's nothing to change or adjust. You're all the same. So you have to constantly think about what's meritorious and then look at policies to see if you need to make adjustments. And that's a hard thing because everybody gets used to it. Everybody's been going to undergrad or middle school and high school to learn these things so that they can get into college. Most people are thinking that way. And to then say, well, what's most important is whether you volunteered. Well, my parents work 2 jobs each, and they're not home, and I have a little sibling. I don't have time to volunteer. Okay. Maybe we can think about some other form of service. And so when you get through this process of bundling, you should think about priorities and just be explicit about those. But also give people broad input, make sure they're achievable, make sure that they're fair in terms of revision. But merit is really tough because we're all baked into a status quo around what's a good thing. If you force people, I don't know if you do this here, if you force people to think about how to evaluate professors' instruction, like how good they are. The one thing that most colleges and universities use are student evaluations, probably the worst measures of instruction and learning, but they are still used. Peer assessments, they're all right, but we're friends, we're both professors, you're doing great. Maybe you should use the internet, but you're doing great. So peer evaluations, they're good, but they don't also solve the problem. So you have to think, this is just to say that you have to really think about these things. You can't let the status quo continue on and assume that it's right, and when people violate it, they teach differently, or they do their research differently, or they don't use quantitative tools, or they're more interested in community-engaged research rather than scholarship in their office and analyzing data. Like, this is too different. I don't understand that, and therefore it's not worthy of promotion and tenure. We should revise that periodically. We should understand the way the world's going, and that's what I'm trying to get across.
Excellent, thanks.
This kind of leads more for your data research. Are there trends in age demographics for the 4 groups that you research, and generally are beliefs different?
Good question. So younger people, 18 to 29, tend to be more racial refrainers. They tend to be more open, low racism, low resentment. But they tend to be also more authoritarian. They tend to have a higher need for chaos, which is a motivation to just say, we should just tear it down. Just burn it to the ground and start over. Like, this is high chaos. It's more conservative orientation. Like, the status quo is a problem, but we need to tear it all down. We don't have any solutions, but just tear it down. And they also tend to, we have this measure of human flourishing, which asks, how happy are you? How much do you find purpose in your everyday activities? Can you delay gratification, the right wording? Do you worry about your bills, paying your bills at the end of the month? They tend to be lower in human flourishing, and therefore that correlates with less hope for democracy. So there's a kind of communication gap, and it's understandable. I mean, COVID happened. You've gotten politics that are just going in and out. The global world order is all disrupted, and people kind of don't know, well, what's the baseline? Where do we start? So younger people tend to have great ideas and energy, but we have to kind of mirror the toolkit with the existing structure to see how change can happen. I don't want to say incrementally, but in ways that don't terrorize and scare the people that have been in office and have some expertise or been in working in government or at the university for a long time. You got to partner and collaborate.
Thank you for that. So on the note of change happening incrementally, I've got a question about the Mercy mission. So, our Mercy mission calls us to lead with compassion, dignity, and a commitment to justice, especially for those who are most marginalized. So based on your research and understanding of this, do you see moral frameworks similar to our Mercy mission centered on care rather than deservingness as having the potential to disrupt racial resentment, or do they risk being absorbed into the same kind of fairness narratives that sustain racial resentment?
That's a good question. I think it's a powerful mission of compassion and care and empathy and thinking about things that aren't like good job. Jobs are important. Income is important. But on this measure of human flourishing around purpose in life, the journey, finding meaning, what fulfills you? I can almost assure you, any rich people in the room, you want to out yourselves? Money doesn't solve all those problems. In fact, it often can make things worse. It's great that you had enough money to buy a big house. Guess what? You got to heat it. You got to keep the yard done. You got to get the floors done, the curtains, which means you can't take off from work. you gotta do it. Like, that's a lot of pressure, and the cycle just continues. So being able to kind of find some meaning and purpose in life really starts with compassion and care for issues that are greater than yourself. Giving, partnering, collaborating, seeing community, believing that service is a pathway to success in life is really powerful. So I spent a lot of time thinking of the critical concerns and how to kind of show something that was relevant to that. And I think that is where you set the values, you set the goals, you give people, like, you can do it any way you want, but this is what you're working toward. And I want you to get some help from other people along the way just to make sure that you're doing it well. So I think the mission is on target and really powerful. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in.
I think it's a
I'm among
powerful word to
friends,
conclude,
but,
yes.
but it is. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the ways in which you help us to enter into that mission more fully. I think this understanding of racial resentment is one that is, like, fundamentally also humanizing, to know, like, what is, when you said, like, what kind of question do you want to ask your neighbor? And when you ask, well, why are you angry? Like, there's a shared experience that we meet one another in. And this understanding of racial resentment then allows us to meet one another.
Give them a chance
in
to
another
just
dimension.
let it out.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to our facilitators as well for this dialogue.
Well done.
So, and today's event is part of a week-long series of events for MLK Week 2026. So we hope that you can join us tomorrow at the same time at 4 o'clock. We're going to be in DeStefano on the other side of campus, and that's for the Mercy Reading Club, and we'll be discussing Dr. Wilson's book, Racial Resentment in the Political Mind, with Dr. Michael Browner, who's the principal of Thompson Middle School. And also earlier tomorrow, we'll be hosting the MLK Vigil for Racial Justice and Nonviolence in the Our Lady of Mercy Chapel. And that's from 1:45 to 2:15. So that's rescheduled from Monday's snow day. So we hope you can join us for that. And one other rescheduling for MLK Week on Sunday, we'll be hosting the MLK Dream Brunch from 11 to 1 in the Young Building. So everyone's invited to all of this, and Mrs. Victoria Johnson, who's with us, is our keynote speaker for the Dream Brunch. So you can check out salve.edu/MLK Week for all the information more, but we hope you can join us for some more to come. But for now, I thank you all for coming and ask you to help me thank our distinguished lecturer and our dialogue facilitator.